A quiet shift has already begun beneath the headlines, beneath the daily tick of markets and the polished speeches in capitals. It has been unfolding for decades, a fracturing of the very infrastructure that binds nations together, the invisible web of credit, trust, and liquidity that makes the modern global economy function. It started not with a bang, but with a series of imperceptible divergences. A new payment system here, an alternate reserve arrangement there, sidestepping the long dominant channels. At first, only specialists noticed, then investors and banks. Now finally, central banks and heads of state are confronting a reality that ancient empires knew all too well. Once the channels of exchange begin to bifurcate, the unity that supported an era begins to dissolve. History does not treat such fractures gently. In the late Roman Republic, competing monetary authorities and divergent standards did not erupt overnight. They crept in as a result of military overextension, fiscal strain, and the erosion of shared norms. By the time the Senate recognized that the denarius no longer held uniform value from Carthage to Britannia, the economic cohesion of the Mediterranean world was already unraveling. Trade costs rose, credit contracted, and loyalty shifted to local patrons who could still honor their coin. The political consequences followed swiftly, and within generations the old order was unrecognizable. Centuries later, the bimetallic system of the 19th century gave way to competing gold standards and then to fiat arrangements. Every transition was justified with confidence, science, and assurances of stability. Every time, systemic stress revealed the limits of the reigning framework. The point of failure was always economic first. Liquidity dried, credit standards fractured, confidence fragmented. Political and military ruptures were consequences, not causes. Now, the contours of a similar pattern are emerging. For the first time since the Bretton Woods era, there are parallel architectures in international finance, competing mechanisms of settlement, divergent reserve holdings, and escalating reliance on alternatives outside the traditional clearing systems. Nations once unified by a single dominant currency are diversifying, not in dozens of small experiments, but at scale. Payment rails are proliferating, swap lines are being replicated, alternate benchmarks are gaining traction. These are not geostrategic gestures alone. They are systemic adaptations to incentives and pressures that the old framework no longer resolves. This is not a crisis in the making. It is the quiet evolution of a bifurcated system, one that still functions, still greases the wheels of commerce, yet operates on fissures no less consequential for their subtlety. And like all such evolutions in history, it accelerates without warning until the old coherence can no longer contain the new reality. What follows is not speculation, it is recognition of a pattern older than the modern state. A pattern that has played out again and again, with only the actors changing, never the outcome. The global financial system is splitting in two. No one can pretend otherwise, and no one can stop what is already in motion. Collapse does not arrive in a single moment. It is not a thunderclap that shatters markets or severs trade routes. It is a process, subtle and persistent, that begins long before observers realize anything is amiss. In the economic realm, collapse starts with distortion. The incentives within the system shift, sometimes imperceptibly, until the structures that once coordinated activity no longer produce the expected results. Confidence, the lifeblood of every financial system, begins to drain not because of a crisis, but because of slow erosion. At first, there are anomalies. Credit spreads widen in one region. Settlement delays emerge on a foreign exchange corridor. Savings flee traditional outlets. None of these triggers alone signals collapse, but together they form a pattern that historians recognize, a system under internal stress. The first stage of decay is what practitioners call imbalance, where accumulated debt, overextended commitments, and misaligned incentives grow until the cost of maintaining the system outweighs the benefits of preserving it. In this stage, distortions are masked by rhetoric and policy, but the seeds of instability take root. Stage 2 is fragmentation. Structural consensus begins to break down. In a monetary system, fragmentation looks like diverging reserve preferences, multiple competing anchors, and alternative clearing mechanisms outside the dominant framework. Trust in a singular standard weakens and actors hedge by seeking substitutes. Fragmentation is slow because incumbents have immense inertia. They have incentives to maintain the status quo, even as newcomers build alternatives. The third stage is liquidity tension. Credit, which once flowed freely across borders and sectors, becomes segmented. The cost of transacting in certain corridors rises. Interbank lending narrows its focus. Once universal instruments of exchange lose their universality. This tension is not an immediate breakdown in markets, but a tightening of them. Liquidity costs increase not because there is no liquidity, but because confidence in future redemption falters. Stage 4 is confidence erosion. This stage is psychological as much as economic. Investors, institutions, and governments begin to question commitments. Centralized anchors lose their unquestioned dominance. New norms are established, quietly at first, but then systematically. At this point, the tipping point is not far. Stage 5 is dislocation. Here, the recognized channels of exchange and settlement no longer function as primary conduits. Parallel systems become primary for many participants. The pricing of risk decouples across regions. The old architecture loses coherence. Dislocation is the phase where the underlying pattern becomes visible even to casual observers. Market behaviors that once seemed unthinkable become routine. Stage 6 is consolidation along new lines. The fragmentation gives way to a new configuration of networks and hierarchies. The old system does not necessarily vanish, but its dominance is supplanted. Actors align with the structures that best reflect their incentives and interests. Finally, Stage 7 is realignment, the historical equivalent of a new equilibrium. This is not recovery in the old sense. It is a transformation into a system with different power centers, different reference anchors, and different behaviors. None of these stages happen overnight. They can take years, even decades, but the transitions between them, once underway, are relentless. And once the system passes a certain point, reversal is no longer possible. The pattern is not a metaphor. It is the structural logic of complex economic networks under stress. As history shows, these stages have repeated across empires, across centuries, and now, in the global financial architecture of the 21st century, we are witnessing them again. In the early 18th century, a small island nation on the edge of Europe began to project its power across the globe in a way the world had never seen. The British Empire was not the first empire, but it became the first whose economic dominance was tied to a comprehensive financial architecture: banks, insurance markets, commodities exchanges, and, most importantly, a reserve currency that others willingly held. London's pound sterling was the clockwork that synchronized global trade, credit, and settlement. Ships left Liverpool carrying manufactured goods. They returned to Calcutta with cotton, to Jamaica with sugar. Every transaction, every contract, every promise for future payment was anchored in the belief that British credit would honor its commitments. The empire's ascent was neither inevitable nor effortless. It rested on structural advantages: a powerful navy to protect shipping lanes, a merchant class willing to innovate, and a financial sector that learned to reconcile risk with reward on an unprecedented scale. By the mid-19th century, London was not merely a city of commerce. It was the counterparty to the world. Nations borrowed in sterling, trade was denominated in it. Profits were repatriated through its markets. This was not the fiat of modern central banks, but a functional consensus. Sterling worked because everyone believed it would. Yet the seeds of structural stress were embedded in its success. To sustain growth and geopolitical commitments, Britain accumulated obligations unrivaled in scope. War after war with rival powers drained the treasury. Military commitments across continents required borrowing on terms that increasingly strained the nation's fiscal capacity. In peace, markets buoyed confidence. In conflict, they began to test it. The Crimean War, the Indian Rebellion, the Boer War, each demanded financing that pushed the banking system toward greater leverage and the state toward deeper debt. As the empire expanded, its productivity did not keep pace with its ambition. Factories churned goods, but agricultural output, infrastructure investment in colonies, and technological innovation were uneven. Consumption was rising, of luxuries at home, of governance abroad, while the capacity to underwrite it all was diminishing. Credit expanded to fill the gap. Private banks lent against speculative ventures. The government issued bonds with ever longer maturities. Markets appeared robust on the surface. Prices were stable, yields were low, and London remained the world's financial hub. But beneath lay distortions. Debt is not inherently dangerous. In a productive system, it finances innovation and growth. But in the British case, much of the debt flowed into sustaining existing commitments rather than expanding productive capacity. Colonial administration, military garrisons, and infrastructure projects often produce social order, not economic return. The costs were real, the revenues were not. And here lies a subtle but profound distinction. Wealth was flowing through the system, from peripheries to the center, from colonies to London, yet it was not creating the internal reinvestment that undergirds long-term stability. By the early 20th century, cracks were appearing. European rivals industrialized rapidly. The United States, once a debtor to British capital, became a competitor in manufacturing and finance. The First World War was the decisive blow to Britain's primacy. It financed the war through debt, much of it to the up-and-coming American financial sector. When victory came, the financial yield was diminished. Sterling's role as the world's reserve currency was challenged, not because Britain lost wars, but because its economy could no longer underwrite the confidence that sterling once inspired. In the aftermath, political concessions followed economic realities. The empire contracted, dominions became autonomous, markets fragmented. The post-war world charted new financial pathways, ones that acknowledged that the old center no longer held the gravitational pull it once did. This was the arc of structural decline. Advantage accrued, obligations expanded, incentives distorted, and finally, the systemic coherence that knit an era together began to unravel. History would repeat this logic again, in different forms, in different centuries. 3 decades later, across a different continent and under very different circumstances, another system followed a hauntingly similar arc. The United States in the early 21st century was widely regarded as different, more technologically advanced, more interconnected, more resilient than any empire before it. Economists, policymakers, and investors repeated the mantra with conviction. This time, structural patterns did not apply. Innovation, global integration, and the depth of its financial markets made it unique. Yet the fundamentals told a familiar story. At the heart of the system was faith, faith in the dollar, faith in the institutions that issued it, faith in the promise of growth. For decades, credit expanded at historic rates. Government debt swelled. Banks leveraged their balance sheets in ways that generated profits but magnified systemic risk. Consumption, particularly in housing and financial instruments, outpaced domestic productivity gains. In essence, the nation was living on the promise of future output rather than the reality of present creation. Warnings emerged, often dismissed as relics of old-school thinking. Analysts noted the unsustainable trajectory of debt, the reliance on continually rising asset prices, the concentration of risk in institutions deemed too big to fail. But the dominant narrative held: technology, globalization, and policy innovation had changed the rules. The stages of collapse outlined in history, imbalance, fragmentation, liquidity tension, confidence erosion, were assumed to be irrelevant. This was denial in the guise of sophistication. When the 2008 financial crisis struck, it revealed how profoundly the old pattern persisted under a modern veneer. Imbalance had built quietly over decades. Fragmentation appeared as shadow banking and off-balance sheet liabilities. Liquidity tension emerged as interbank trust evaporated overnight. Confidence eroded across markets. Governments intervened, temporarily consolidating the system along new lines, but not without cost. The remedies patched the system's symptoms, not its structural vulnerabilities. The pattern had repeated. Incentives drove behavior, distortions accumulated, and collapse, or near collapse, arrived despite assurances that this time was different. The lesson was clear, though often overlooked. Structural collapse does not require malevolence or ignorance. It requires incentive misalignment, debt accumulation, and a divergence between consumption and productive capacity. Denial delays adjustment, and delay accelerates the transition from slow decay to irreversible change. The United States did not invent collapse. It experienced it in a contemporary context, proving the timelessness of the pattern and the human inclination to dismiss lessons from history when success feels permanent. Today, that same structural logic is emerging on a global scale, only now it is amplified by technology, geopolitics, and the scale of financial interdependence. The international system, long unified around a single dominant reserve currency, is quietly bifurcating. Nations are diversifying reserves, creating alternative payment systems, and building parallel infrastructures to facilitate trade and credit outside traditional channels. This is not a matter of ideology or geopolitics alone. It is the natural response to incentives, risk, and the perception that reliance on a single dominant system concentrates vulnerability. Debt levels remain historically high across advanced economies. Productivity growth has slowed. The cost of maintaining the existing financial architecture, the liquidity support, swap lines, and implicit guarantees, continues to rise. Yet the incentive to innovate outside the system is now stronger than the incentive to preserve the old coherence. Markets, banks, and states are increasingly operating along dual rails, one anchored in the old global reserve, another in emerging alternatives. Trust, once monolithic, is now conditional and diversified. Confidence, a fragile commodity, is shifting as well. Corporations hedge not just against currency risk, but against systemic exposure to a single dominant system. Central banks experiment with digital currencies, alternative clearinghouses, and regional swaps. What appears stable exchange rates, functioning capital markets, uninterrupted trade, masks an underlying reconfiguration of relationships and flows. The architecture is splitting, not collapsing, yet. But history shows that once dual structures gain momentum, they accelerate toward a tipping point where one cannot simply revert to the previous equilibrium. This is not a political story, it is a structural one. The failures of systems are rarely caused by bad intentions or poor leadership. They occur because the incentives that once coordinated behavior no longer function as designed. Debt obligations become unsustainable, networks fragment, confidence wanes, and parallel systems emerge to capture value that the old system cannot deliver. The historical record, from Rome to Britain to modern America, demonstrates that bifurcation and collapse follow the same invisible logic. The global economy is not immune. It is merely the latest stage of a recurring pattern, quietly unfolding beneath the surface of daily headlines. Late-stage systems carry a peculiar illusion of stability. Everything seems orderly, institutions appear resilient, and narratives of strength dominate media and boardrooms alike. Yet this is precisely the phase when the system is most vulnerable. History reveals it repeatedly. The closer a system is to its tipping point, the more confident its leaders appear, and the louder the assurances of continuity become. Denial is institutionalized, risk is normalized, and the mechanisms that once enforced discipline are repurposed to preserve the status quo. Warnings, no matter how reasoned, are often dismissed as alarmist or irrelevant. Analysts may highlight rising debt ratios, mounting leverage, or the expansion of parallel financial infrastructures, but these are treated as anomalies rather than structural signals. Meanwhile, actors within the system continue behaviors that have long since outpaced the capacity of the architecture to sustain them. Liquidity flows as expected, credit instruments trade as usual, and markets appear calm. The paradox is that stability at this stage is not a sign of health. It is the final facade before rapid deterioration. The acceleration phase is also psychological. Institutional leaders, conditioned to trust in historical successes, misread signals. Incentives reward short-term performance over long-term resilience. Narratives of control, inevitability, or uniqueness dominate discourse. Every intervention is framed as precautionary, not corrective. The result is that the system lulls its participants into complacency even as underlying fragilities compound. When the tipping point arrives, the mechanisms of denial, previously sustaining confidence, collapse, and the transition from apparent stability to systemic disruption occurs with a speed that belies decades of slow decay. At this juncture, parallel structures that were once secondary suddenly become essential. Actors shift loyalties not out of ideology but out of necessity. Markets reprice, liquidity reallocates, and old channels can no longer sustain the flows they once managed. History teaches that this acceleration phase is the point at which reversal becomes almost impossible. Once the system passes it, the trajectory toward a new configuration, one shaped by structural incentives rather than human intent, is unstoppable. Cycles are not punishments, and history does not move out of malice. They move because human incentives, behaviors, and institutions repeat patterns that favor short-term gain over long-term stability. Societies, empires, and financial systems expand, innovate, and consume beyond their means because the mechanisms of reward encourage it. Credit flows where profit is highest, resources concentrate where power is strongest, and trust follows predictable paths, until those paths fracture under the weight of accumulated distortions. The lesson of centuries is stark but simple. Structural realities always assert themselves, no matter the intentions of those in charge. Rome, Britain, modern America, each demonstrates that when productivity lags consumption, when debt accumulates faster than output, and when confidence becomes conditional rather than universal, systems move through the same stages of imbalance, fragmentation, tension, erosion, dislocation, consolidation, and realignment. Intentions cannot override these dynamics. Policies cannot indefinitely suspend them. The forces at play are impersonal, inexorable, and rooted in the architecture of incentives itself. Observing the present, we see the global financial system quietly dividing along two channels, each with its own clearing mechanisms, reserve preferences, and risk calculations. This is neither scandal nor conspiracy. It is the natural evolution of a system under strain. Participants follow the incentives embedded in the structure. Some hedge, some innovate, some adapt. All are acting rationally within a framework that history predicts will eventually shift irreversibly. What appears gradual can accelerate without warning, and what appears stable can vanish in the span of a single cycle. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.